Forget the romantic tales and knights glorified in legends. From the 10th to the 17th century, marriage in Europe was more of a practical arrangement than a story of tender feelings. Girls were often betrothed while still very young, so that their families could gain more land, livestock, or strengthen their social standing. The will of the elders, cold calculation, and the silent approval of the church shaped how entire generations lived. For a woman, marriage most often meant a duty, to bear children, endure hardships, and remain silent. In this story, you'll read about everything that was once spoken of only in whispers, how brides were chosen and bargained for, what happened during the first wedding nights, and why a girl standing at the altar almost never had the right to say no. If you are ready, read on. This is the story of medieval marriage, without embellishments. Forget about love at first sight. In the Middle Ages, marriage often felt as cold and harsh as a damp cellar, filled with the smell of money, farmyards, and the quiet sobs of children promised away like livestock. Two wealthy barons would lean over a table, buzzing with flies. "My little girl for your son, and in return, you'll give me your forest and a couple dozen hens." And the bride? No one asked for her thoughts. She sat in a corner, eyes red from crying, already knowing her body would seal this bargain. Sometimes an engagement happened when the child could barely speak. 7 years old, 5, or still wrapped in swaddling clothes. The main thing was a signed parchment and cheap wine for the guests. Children were taken to bride markets, much like cattle. Their teeth were checked, hips felt through their dresses, chins lifted for inspection. A mother would stand by, promising, "Look at her. She's strong. She'll bear children easily." Meanwhile, the father haggled over the dowry as his daughter sniffed pungent fumes and listened to the laughter of strange men. Sometimes the betrothal was settled right then and there, sitting on her father's knee. She nodded because her mother whispered, "Nod, or you'll get the strap later." At home, the girl was raised carefully, like a fragile vase. Sit still, don't complain. Listen quietly when grown men argued over land and livestock. In villages, elders would mutter, "Best check her health," while women murmured to each other that it wouldn't hurt to feel her belly, to avoid buying a barren womb. At night, nannies listened outside the door to make sure the little bride didn't run away. Or worse, on the village square, the entire agreement was displayed for all to see. Old men spat on the ground, chickens darted between their feet, parents slapped each other's shoulders. It was done, a new alliance sealed. Love, let the smell of manure stand for love. It had little to do with marriage. Each union was like throwing raw meat to a hungry beast, called family honor. Refuse? Try to whisper a protest. You'd get a slap and shouts of shame on the whole family. If a family broke the deal, the dowry and animals were taken back, and the family name dragged through the mud until even the village dogs stayed away. So children lived, locked inside the cage of other people's ambitions, little pawns on a board where there was never a check, but always a final mate. The church required that the bride and groom give their verbal consent, but in reality, this meant very little. Girls were often promised to men twice or 3 times their age, sometimes even older. For a family, this was a way to place their daughter under a secure roof and gain a good payment or protection. Often, The groom was a widower with a house full of children, or an aging lord urgently needing a young wife to bear a new heir. Some old chronicles mention that girls were carefully inspected before the wedding to see if she was healthy, without defects, and able to give birth. Meanwhile, the groom might be 40 or 50 years old. For the village or the feudal lord, it didn't matter that the girl was frightened and barely understood what was happening. What mattered was that her blood was young and her body strong. The church loved to speak grandly about free consent, but in practice, this was often an empty phrase. A 12-year-old girl would be led by the hands to the altar, where a just as confused 14-year-old boy waited. If the bride started to cry or tremble, relatives and neighbors stood close behind. Some whispered threats, some raised a fist, some gave a push. If that wasn't enough, they would grab her by the hair, shake her, or frighten her with warnings that she'd be sent back in shame to disgrace the whole family. In the end, the exhausted girl would whisper a faint yes through tears and sniffles. No one cared, as long as the word was spoken, even if forced through fear and pressure. On paper, it looked holy and pure. In life, it was forced submission under the solemn singing of the church choir. In the Middle Ages, a daughter was often seen not as a person, but as a living pledge. A wedding was less a celebration and more a transfer of property, sealed with signatures, vows, and practical agreements. The law sided firmly with fathers. A man could arrange or sell his daughter to whomever he wished, even to an elderly widower with a house full of children. A single signed document and the church's blessing made the deal binding. If a bride tried to run away, she would be brought back or locked away in a convent. It was considered entirely lawful to give a healthy girl in marriage in exchange for a sack of grain or a couple of cows. Judges turned a blind eye as long as no one disputed the payment or the dowry. For a feudal lord or a peasant, a daughter was primarily a womb for an heir, a free servant guaranteed by the law. The law only stirred if someone failed to pay what was promised. Everything else was left to the family and the village. Mothers were rarely asked for their opinion. A woman herself remained subordinate, and her voice carried little weight even in her own home. Of course, many mothers felt deep sorrow giving away their daughters, especially when they knew exactly whose house they were sending them into. But the choice was simple: accept it and hope the daughter would survive and find her place, or argue with the husband and risk beatings, hunger, or the disgrace of the whole family. Many women themselves had grown up in such marriages, so daughters were raised to endure just like mother did. It was simply part of how a family survived in a village or castle. There was always pity, but almost never the power to change anything. In a medieval household, a girl was not taught to dream of happiness, but to survive in someone else's bed. From a young age, thread, a clay pot, and quiet obedience. For a boy, a knife, a plow, and the skill to bow before power. By 12, a girl was already considered ready. A 14-year-old boy, whom she might see for the first time just moments before the vow, had no say either. Adults decided everything. A ring on the finger was not a symbol of love. It was a seal on property. Wine, furs, or sometimes gold were gifted not to the bride, but to her father. Breaking such an agreement meant bringing shame on the entire family. The judge could seize land, the church could cast a curse, and neighbors would spread tales until her own kin would turn her out into the cold. The wedding day became a show for curious eyes and coarse whispers. On the church steps stood two young souls, who often hadn't exchanged even a word. Beside them, a priest. Behind them, the whole village, to witness who now owned this young flesh. Witnesses were gathered in plenty to hear her shaky, yes, squeezed out through tears and fear. From that moment on, taking it back was impossible. No one would believe it hadn't been freely spoken. A father held his daughter's hand like a lead rope and passed her into another man's grasp. From that moment, the girl was new property in her husband's household. A veil hid her face until all vows were spoken. Beneath the veil, trembling in tears, but no one cared. What mattered was that the agreement did not run away. The priest blessed the union for a handful of coins and a piece of fatty pork. Let him answer for it in the afterlife, so long as the record was done properly. The crowd didn't keep silent. Men muttered, cracked crude jokes just behind the young bride's back. Some debated whether she would bear a child right away or need a few more winters of hearty meals. The best man and his sword weren't for show. Should anyone try to interfere or steal the bride away, blood would spill on the grass. After the blessing came the feast and days of loud celebration. For 3 days they sang, laughed, threw dice, drank ale until they retched, and joked about how many children she would bear for the household. When the noise died down, the most impatient guests would hover near the bridal chamber door, eager to see whether the new womb had fled, bitten her husband's ear, or broken the window to escape. Beside her stood her new master, and in that moment she became a stranger, even to herself. Her entire life now lay in a ring, a vow, the neighbor's whispers, and the straw beneath another's body. When the feast ended, a deeper fear began. The first wedding night in the Middle Ages rarely had anything to do with tenderness. It was all about proof. A girl, often still just a child, was expected to shed blood to show that no man had touched her before her husband. The stained bed linen was carried outside so that neighbors and relatives could see for themselves. If there were no stains, gossip spread, shame followed, and exile was possible. For noble families, it meant a broken alliance, lost lands, and a wife abandoned with nowhere to go. For peasants, it was humiliation for all to see. If luck was on her side, the lord of the manor would not claim her bed first. It was believed that the feudal lord held the right of the first night, and any peasant bride could find herself under him while her husband waited helplessly outside. Wealthier peasants paid a fee to keep the lord away. The poor could only endure in silence. Even after this ordeal, the young couple was not truly left alone. There was a tradition known as the bedding ceremony, where family members and even the priest would escort the couple to bed, watch as she was undressed, whisper, laugh, and listen at the door for the first sounds. In some villages, relatives would sit right by the bed to ensure the newlyweds did not run away or avoid their first night together. And this was not the end. The church laid down strict rules about when a couple could be together. No intimacy on Sundays, during Lent, on Thursdays, and on many other forbidden days. A woman could not refuse her husband. It was her marital duty, sacred, yet heavy. A husband could refuse without consequence. For in marriage, a wife was not seen as a person with her own will, but as a vessel for children and a symbol of the family's honor, and nothing more. After the first wedding night, the girl faced a new, harsh reality. Pregnancy after pregnancy. Her body became the foundation of the family's future. As many children as she could bear, she would deliver 10 times, 15 times, with no trained doctors, no reliable medicines, only rough knives in the tired hands of a village midwife. One mistake, and blood would soak the straw beneath her, with no one able to save her in time. Most women died from festering wounds after childbirth or fever. Infection spread silently, while neighbors whispered at the door, "It's all right. The husband needs a new wife anyway. He'll find another." If she died, life moved on. The womb was more important than the woman. The birth of a son saved everything. Family honor, the land, the marriage itself. But if there were no children, mocking whispers began, and soon enough, she could be cast aside if someone younger and more obedient appeared. All this unfolded under the quiet or loud blessing of the church. Priests love to preach. Wives, submit to your husbands. If a husband beat his wife, it was called moderate correction. The church turned a blind eye as long as the blows did not kill immediately. Divorce was nearly unthinkable. Marriage was a lifelong chain. Permission to break it was given rarely, and only to those who could prove themselves nearly saintly. In parts of Germany, some couples famously fought in front of the entire village for the right to separate. The husband would stand buried to his neck in a pit, while the wife struck him with a sack of stones. Whoever won was declared free. This is how the church upheld the sacred bond, through fear, pain, and a sense of no escape. Thus ended an age when family was valued above feelings, and a girl was nothing more than a pledge in a deal. Thankfully, this time is behind us. Today, we can love by our own choice, and we should remember the price paid to gain this freedom.